You're live.
Very good. Good evening, everyone. It's July 14th, 2022 on this lovely sunny summer evening. This meeting's called to order. Annual notice of this meeting was provided to the Star Ledger, Home News Tribune, and Highland Park Planet on January 29th, 2022. In addition, notice of this meeting via Zoom was faxed to the Home News Tribune and emailed to the Star Ledger and the Highland Park Planet on July 12th, 2022, and was posted on the Borough website at www.hpborough.com and on the bulletin board at Borough Hall, located at 221 South 5th Avenue, Highland Park, New Jersey, on July 12th, 2022, and has remained continuously posted as required by law. All right. Very good. All right. Tanya, if you would take a roll call for us, please.
Ms. Hand,
Present.
Mr. Brusher,
Here.
Mr. Chin,
I'm here.
Ms. Hadhazi,
Here.
Mr. Hale,
Here.
Mr. Linares, Mr. Malay,
Here.
Mr. Perlman,
Here.
Mr. Stern Cardinal,
Here.
Mr. Williams,
Here.
Mr. Douglas,
Here.
Mr. Cosenza,
Here.
Mr. Koch, that's it.
Very good. All right. This evening we have Eric Douglas, who's going to be our attorney this evening to continue to guide us as we go through our meeting. So welcome.
Thank you.
First order of business is to welcome, or rather, I should say, we are hoping to welcome our new board clerk, Tanya Varela. Did I say that right? Tanya Varela. She started this meeting, took our roll call. So far, she's doing a great job. So at this time, what I'd like to do is solicit a motion to have Tanya formally appointed as our new board clerk.
I motion.
Motion by Khalidra,
Second.
second by Pedrick. I think we can do this by voice vote. Is that right, Eric?
That's right.
All in favor?
Aye.
I
Motion passes. Tanya, you're officially our new board secretary. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, second order of business. We have a consistency review of a proposed amendment to the Highland Park Code, amending Chapter 230 concerning deed restriction control periods and mandatory set-aside requirements. I believe the members of the board have had the opportunity to receive and review the proposed amendments. Our board's role is to review these proposed changes and determine whether or not they are inconsistent with the master plan, and more specifically, that they are not inconsistent with the master plan. For anyone needing guidance on where they can find the master plan, it's located at www.hpborough.com under the tab Government, sub-tab Planning and Zoning, and there's a link to the master plan and its re-examination reports. So that being said, I'd like to open up to the board for any comments about the ordinance for amending Chapter 230 concerning deed restricted control periods and mandatory set-aside requirements.
Seems very straightforward.
I don't disagree with you. I did have a couple of technical comments. There are several times in the proposed language where it's referred to the borough or the borough planning / zoning board. I know we have combined boards in some towns, but we do have two distinct boards. Sometimes they are referred to distinctly, planning or zoning, or planning and zoning boards. So it's a technical matter. I think that the language should just be fixed to reflect the fact that we have two distinct boards. And then as a personal notation here, on page 2, paragraph B, at the third line up from the big paragraph, there's a reference to FSHC, which for those of you following along with the drama of the litigation the borough has been undertaking might already know what that stands for, but I don't think FSHC is readily understood, and perhaps the full name should be spelled out there for reference if it's going into the code. I had a similar comment lower down for COA and UHAC, but far less concerning since I think most people who are reading these code sections would know what those are referring to. But I think FSHC probably needs a little bit of a expansion. But those were my comments to the proposed language. That being said, anyone else have any thoughts?
I think we can take care of those.
Thank you, Matt. Okay. All right, well, if there's no other thoughts or comments or questions about whether this is not inconsistent with our master plan, I'll take a motion here on whether we feel this is not inconsistent with our master plan. Motion by Pedro, did you want to make a comment or a motion?
No, motion to adopt.
All right, motion to adopt by Pedro,
Second.
second by Dan Cardinal. Tanya, I think this one has to be a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Brusher,
Yes.
Mr. Chin,
Yes.
Ms. Hadhazi, Mr. Hale,
Oh, Collegiate,
Yes.
Mr. Hale,
Yes.
Mr. Malay,
Yes.
Mr. Pearlman,
Yes.
Mr. Stern Cardinal,
Yes.
Mr. Williams,
Yes.
Ms. Hand.
yes. Okay. All right, so that brings us to our third agenda item concerning bulk regulations, parking, and residential design standards, amendments to the borough code. Chris, I think you gave us a presentation on this in December, if I'm not mistaken, with the preliminary thoughts on these amendments. But since we have new members of the board and it's been half a year since that presentation, I will turn attention over to you for thoughts, comments, and background.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So members of the board, members of the public are available. I just wanted
Chris.
to,
Hey,
Yes.
Chris, I'm sorry, before you get going, could you just for the record state your name, spell your last name?
sure. My name is Chris Cosenza, Cosenza.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start from the beginning. So Madam Chair, board members of the board, and members of the public. So I think as the chair indicated, I had previously done actually a couple presentations to the planning board, mainly to the benefit sort of reminders where we were heading, where we're going. Since there are a couple members of the board who are new, I think it would be worth sort of going through like an overview of sort of where we started and where we ended with the ordinance in your hands. So I'm going to share my screen, kind of do a presentation. I'm hoping it won't be more than 8 to 10 minutes. Can't promise you that, because I tend to overpromise. So I will start with obviously the master plan. I know the end goal is for the board to make a finding that the proposed ordinance is not inconsistent with the master plan. I don't think you'll find any easier ordinance to make that same finding, because the ordinance is a direct extension and really a codification of the recommendations contained in the master plan. For those who were working with us on the 2019 master plan and land use plan element update, you will find this presentation very familiar. And I think it's important to go through that. It really is actually important to remind ourselves that the goal to have some sort of design standards to improve infill housing really has been in place for almost 20 years. Back in 2003, it was actually, I poke fun at the borough and ourselves as planners that this was a short-term goal back in 2003. It is what it is. The priorities change. But we did have an opportunity to really revisit it in 2019 and explore it. As a planner myself, it was important for us not to just dive into the recommendations, because it should be rooted in some sort of analysis and understanding of the community. The master plan was sort of perfect for that. Plus, we had been planners for the community since 2016. So by then we had a pretty good understanding of the zoning ordinance and the issues that you were facing. So in that analysis, as part of the master plan, we did analysis of the zoning map, and of course, as part of the master plan effort, we created this new beautifully colored map, I might say, but it did allow us to sort of isolate, okay, so what's going on with the RA, RB district? Those are the predominant residential uses, zoning districts in the borough of Highland Park. And what we found through GIS analysis is that 2 out of every 5 lots in Highland Park are not conforming. 40%, almost 40%. That's pretty challenging and daunting to really fix, so to speak. But we did have some strategies, trying to do what we can without having to do a bunch of new zoning districts. That will take often months or years to really resolve. So what's appropriate for the neighborhood. So we took a look at what's on the ground, really what's been built with the zoning in place. What's unique in Highland Park is that you have one zoning district, basically same regulations for all these lots, no matter whether you have a 100-foot wide lot, 50 or 35-foot wide lot. That becomes an issue when you have 10-foot side yard setbacks on a 35-foot wide lot, which means you only have 15 feet to work with. 100-foot lot, obviously not an issue. So there's clearly an issue, even though the neighborhood pattern was showing the homes were bigger and sort of snug in better and kind of fit in well in places like on Graham Avenue and on Johnson Street. So one of the recommendations that came out of the master plan effort was to really recalibrate the bulk regulations. And the thought was really taking a look at the side yard setback requirements, looking at the coverage controls, especially when it came to smaller lots. And these were also issues that the zoning board had raised in their review of just a few applications that came before the board. In many cases, it was like, we're sorry that you're here, applicant, but you do need a variance. This is a unique case, not a unique case, but you do hit the criteria for a variance. So our suggestions was we should probably rethink the bulk regulations in addition to the design standards themselves. So that's back in 2019. We are now at the codification point. And the ordinance before you is really in two forms. Part 1 is sort of the written document, basically the Word document with all about 20-ish pages of some corrections. I call them housekeeping because there's a lot of corrections we probably should have made years ago, but this is the opportunity to make those corrections. Then obviously the recalibration of bulk regulations. And then the part 2 is the graphic-based residential form-based code. So going into part 1A, so just sort of high level, we are relocating certain standards from performance standards into zoning. We're deleting attached garages that you have been familiar with for some years, but they do live on in a different form in the residential form-based code, which I'll get in a little bit of detail. This issue came up during the council introduction issue with what are we dealing with the residential parking requirements. The truth is, residential site improvement standards have been in place since, I believe, 1997. That superseded any municipal regulation on residential parking. So all this was really just to clean up the ordinance by removing the 2 parking spaces that are required within each of the zoning districts, because that isn't in play. It's always been RSIS. It's just a matter of cleaning up. And Highland Park is not the only town who simply just left the old regulations in the code. After all, it is superseded by RSIS, and this is just a matter of cleaning it up. Another housekeeping was removing references to RC zone because it simply does not exist anymore. We also looked at cleaning up the zoning schedule, which is all over the list that the zoning officer and I use to kind of gauge whether or not an application is conforming. Just sort of clean it up to be consistent with everything else that we've added or changed in this ordinance. Supplementary zoning provisions really include other zoning requirements to allow us to consider and approve and allow permitted projections. Right now, the current ordinance doesn't allow porches to project into a yard. The front yard setback is measured to the porch, which is very unusual. Most communities allow front porch projections into yards. So to codify that into the ordinance, something we've recommended, and I'm sure, and I know the planning board and some subdivision applications have allowed that as a variance condition. So this will now be permitted as of right. Also, the relocation of height exemptions, and then dealing with the water table issue by something that Bruce Koch and I are feel strongly about, is like asking applicants that go to the board for subdivisions is you got to keep that basement 1 foot above the seasonal high water table. Almost all builders have said, sure, not a problem. What this does, this ordinance codifies it for all new construction. And to couple that, to make sure the houses don't come shooting out of the ground to avoid that water table, we also have a maximum distance that the first floor can be from grade. Because I think as you drive around your neighborhood and you see your neighbors, most of them are about 3 to 4 feet above the ground. Some lower, a little bit higher, but on average, the typical condition is about no more than 4 feet. So this codifies that. We also relocated and expanded exemptions for non-conforming conditions. So this would include an undersized lot, non-conforming side yard setbacks. You may have too much coverage and you're asking for an addition that won't affect it. Right now, you would need a variance. Now you won't need a variance anymore as long as you don't make the non-conforming situation worse. And the same thing for height as well. What we're trying to do is there are situations where many homeowners need a variance for such a small thing. They're always approved because some other part of the house is not conforming and their addition is not affecting it. So what this ordinance does, it allows for modest additions to be proposed without the need for a variance, so long it doesn't make a non-conforming condition worse. As far as the recalibration, we talked about front yard setbacks. This is again a codification that we're suggesting instead of just 20 feet, this should be responsive to your neighborhood and the historic pattern of the development, which is to be generally in line with your neighbors, but be within 1 or 2 feet of it. We didn't want to write an ordinance that said you had to be exactly average, because what happens if you're 1 inch off? That's been an issue in other communities, so that's why it needs to be within 2 feet. So it gives the flexibility in case there's errors in your field, but also to sort of respond to certain conditions. There's also a minimum condition. We don't want houses too close to the street. And then we have also provisions that sort of deal with, well, how do you deal with vacant lots? Questions that many other communities deal with. So we try to fix it here, nip it at the bud. Then sort of like the exciting thing, which I think some homeowners are waiting to see, was sort of dealing with that 10-foot side yard setback that's always required. For narrow lots, basically anything less than 60 feet, you no longer have to comply with 10 feet. Now it's 5, 6, 7, or 8. The side yard setback is proportional to your lot width, which is a pattern that we saw when we studied the zoning patterns in the neighborhood. So this again codifies it, gives it a lot more flexibility, doesn't trigger variances, and allows for new construction, especially subdivisions, if there are any, to be more consistent with the pattern on the street. Again, the planning board has approved applications that needed variances because they were proposing 6-foot side yard setbacks or what have you, because it was our suggestion, because it would get more conforming to the neighborhood, even though it's not conforming to the current ordinance. And the planning board has been great with understanding, yeah, this is more appropriate despite the fact that it needs variances. And what this does, it sort of rectifies that in the base zoning. Same thing with coverage. I know, Madam Chair, you were curious where we landed on exemptions, like how do we deal with pervious paving or green infrastructure? To be honest, it was a difficult one to deal with. So what we decided to do was we increase impervious coverage for the really, really small lots. Right now it's 40%. We're going to increase that to 45% for the really small lots, like on Graham and Johnson. And then we actually reduce coverage on the really large lots where there's plenty of space. However, if anyone's triggered by a variance condition, you have that non-conforming coverage provision to protect you. So the exemptions where we landed on was to basically take care of HVAC, porches, decks, detached garages, and pervious paving, all together not to exceed 500 square feet. I toyed with the idea of doing a percentage base, but it didn't benefit the smallest lots because obviously a percentage of a small lot, it does not generate as much square footage for a larger lot. So I stuck with a blanket 500 square foot exemption, which which really means that for a really small lot, you can get up to what's an effective 50 to about 55% impervious coverage, which on a small lot is pretty typical, pretty standard. So it's not inconsistent with this was actually on the ground. And in a way, the exemption for decks, currently the ordinance allows for 5% additional building coverage, impervious coverage. So this, we sort of replaced that with total 500 square feet in combination with porches, HVAC equipment, garages, and patios. And then we decided that there's no limit for accessible ramps. A lot of communities do that. We don't think there should be a trigger for variances for whenever there's a need for an accessible ramp. And that applies to coverage as well as setbacks. So part 2, this is where the graphic form-based code comes in handy. So not much has changed in terms of the graphics other than color coding it different. And I'll show you on a separate document. But as you are aware from the presentation I gave back in January or December, it was mainly to deal with orientation of sidewalks, front walls and sidewall lengths, as well as articulation, meaning minimum fenestration. In other words, a minimum number of windows, because we don't like to see blank walls. And it's not that because we don't like it as a subjective thing. It's because the pattern of existing historic construction in the borough and in many communities throughout the country is that there are windows on sidewalls, believe it or not. So this sort of looks at a way, let's be more consistent with historic construction by requiring some sort of fenestration on sidewalls. And I'm only talking about 5% of openness. Then we also dealt with garage location and design, which goes on for several pages on how to deal with the garage stepbacks. And then we had some provisions for landscaping and tree replanting. The current ordinance does not have minimum standards. So someone could propose 2 new homes on a subdivision, no landscaping whatsoever. And that's not consistent with the borough's historic pattern. There's a beautiful yards, tree plantings, and almost every single lot in Highland Park. There's no reason why a new house shouldn't have it as well, within reason. Obviously, we don't want trees on top of water lines. We don't want them crowding each other and suffocating each other. And we don't want landscaping on top of the house, which would encourage moisture damage, pest issues. So there's minimum standards, but the ordinance doesn't go into what it must look like. It's just a sort of numerical requirement. We also dealt with accessory structures and mechanical equipment. So basically, we now have provisions to allow for small sheds to be set back just 3 feet, which is a reasonable standard. Real small sheds, 3 feet setback. If they're larger, then it should be 5 feet setback. And there currently aren't any regulations for how to deal with AC units, which has been a sort of bane of many zoning officials' existence, including Highland Park. So we codified reasonable setbacks for HVAC equipment, which means not in the front yard, but a few feet setback from the side yard. So it doesn't really negatively impact neighboring property owners, because generators can be loud when they're tested, and AC units that are, particularly if they're older, can be pretty loud. So that's sort of the big picture summary. I like to explain this as this is why we do form-based code, a graphic element, because sometimes we talk about all the revision, and when you talk about it or just write about it, it's very confusing. It's like, what do you mean by that? And a picture literally paints a town, really talks in 1,000 words. It really does explain and help builders, homeowners, developers, the zoning official, and ourselves. When we talk about these provisions, this is generally what we're talking about. And the models and the plan graphics help illustrate what we're talking about. That way there's no misinterpretation, and it also obviously helps with explaining what the intent is. So the left is what you currently have, is just a wall of text. On the right side, simple text coupled with some models and pictures. And that's the sort of the consistent pattern we use in this form-based code. So this is about 13 pages. I'm not going to go through them all. They're in your packet. So the main changes is we sort of increase the text size so it's more accessible for those who read it. And we change the color pattern so it's a little bit more in tune with the Highland Park colors, which is a cute thing, but also to use the cover overlays to help illustrate what it is in the model and in the plan graphic or elevation graphic that we're talking about. So instead of using the confusing green and yellows that we use in Princeton, we use the color overlays to help emphasize the topic that we're talking about. So on this page, these are just minimum front wall articulation. So you can see that 15% openness that's required will generate a window pattern that is more consistent with what's out in historic neighborhoods throughout Highland Park. And the same issue with sidewalls. 5% only requires a couple of windows, but it's better than no windows at all. There's also a requirement for walls stepping in and out. And these are all provisions that we tested with a lot of developers over the past few years of subdivisions. So again, these are just codifications of what we put in the master plan and what we've tested with builders going with subdivisions who would need variances, and that the planning board in almost all cases approved. So I think this is sort of a culmination of that effort. But to be honest, I think this is really just the first step of a series of corrections and change that we're going to make into the ordinance. There's a lot of other things we want to change in the ordinance, and this is sort of the big first step. And I'm really looking forward to working with you all and the staff and the community to figure out what other issues we can do next. My forte personally is I like doing zoning audits and fixing them to be more in tune with the community. So that's it. I went way over 8 minutes. I apologize, but that's basically the ordinance in a nutshell. There is a lot to it, but as I mentioned in the beginning, it's not inconsistent with the master plan. There's no easier case to make than this particular ordinance. That's my testimony for tonight. And if any questions from the board or any member from the public, I'd be happy to entertain them and answer them.
All right, well, why don't we start with the board members? First person I saw was Alvin. Alvin, why don't you go ahead?
Chris, thanks for the presentation. I appreciate that Highland Park is moving forward with the form-based code. I had first a question about implementation of form-based code in other jurisdictions. I believe that you have, you're the planner, or your firm is the planner for Princeton, which also adopted a similar code. Can you tell me what the experience for that municipality has been since the change in code?
Well, our answer to that in two parts. Generally speaking, it's hard to do a form-based code because in many cases, you're trying to design a building and a block with aesthetics in mind. That you can't do for 1-family and 2-family homes pursuant to the municipal land use law. Single-family and 2-family homes are exempt from site plan review. So we had to be careful when we were looking at this originally with Princeton, and Metuchen and Highland Park and the communities we've worked in, is that the provisions that we are writing really function as customized bulk regulations. We have to stay at the bulk level. And we've gotten buy-in through the attorneys, by the attorneys in the other communities to make it consistent with the municipal land use laws, basically saying, yes, you can do that. So that's how we're able to get it done in Princeton and obviously in Highland Park. It's just consistent approach, keeping it at the bulk regulations level. As far as getting community buy-in, obviously this was part of the master plan effort. We use the analysis to say we need to fix the ordinance, and the pictures again explain 1,000 words, so to explain we can do it differently by doing it this way, and it's more consistent with the housing stock. So I answered in 2 different ways. So I just want to ask, did that answer your question?
I was mainly focused on how, I guess, people who are looking to modify property to build something had handled it. And it seems like there was no problem. Would you say that's right? They received the code and were able to interpret it just as we'd hope. You'd hope.
In terms of when it was adopted, was Princeton able to interpret it and enforce it?
Or people who are interested in developing their property or modifying their property?
Yes. Well, that's basically where the models and the plans come in. It sort of illustrates and makes clear what it is that the code provisions are talking about. Otherwise, if you're stuck with a law of text, then it's hard difficult to interpret even by the zoning official. And in this case, but both in Princeton and in Highland Park's case, we've worked with staff to ensure the language that we were using was, first of all, consistent with the written language in the ordinance,
Right.
as well as to make sure that they understood what it was that the provisions mean. As far as builders had no problems in Princeton. So occasionally you've seen it for the first time. They may have to read it once to understand it. But there will be a lot of questions at first, I'm sure.
Okay. All right. If I could ask another question, I saw that there was some code proposed about accessory structures. Is it fairly well understood that that does not include dwellings?
Yeah, currently the borough doesn't have a provision allowing for accessory dwellings.
Okay.
Certainly that's a topic that the council could explore, but if that is discussed, that can be coupled with the discussion on accessory structures.
Right, but there's no room for misinterpretation of accessory structures as being used for residences.
Correct. The previously had amendments to the accessory structures ordinance. I believe Councilman Hale had worked on that a couple of years ago. That addressed home occupations, but didn't address dwellings. All this ordinance does is really relocating the ordinance and just deals with setback locations, setback distance requirements, not the use.
Thanks.
Matt?
Just Alvin, to the accessory structure regulations that we put forth a couple of years ago were very explicit about not having accessory dwellings. So I think that part is pretty clear. That doesn't mean that we might not revise that or think about that in the future, but as of now, the structure part of it is pretty clear that it can't be a dwelling. I think my memory is that you can't have plumbing, and you can't have, which makes a dwelling kind of impossible. And then
Isn't it that you can have
No,
4-inch
you could
pipe
have-
plumbing? Yeah, Kalidra.
Yeah. It was that you could have plumbing that was like a sink. You couldn't have like
Right,
a
that's it.
toilet or shower.
right. So you can have a sink but no shower. So
Mhm.
and then Alvin, were you asking about whether or not when Princeton or Metuchen did this, if there was it seemed to be an increase in people's attempts to do things to their houses? Is that what you're?
I was mainly interested not in the development of the code, but in how once the code was enforced, people reacted, whether they were builders or neighbors of people who were having building done. And it seemed like most of the, if I understand Chris correctly, the builders had no problem with interpreting and understanding the new code. Is that?
Yes, true. I don't want to put a broad brush and paint builders in a bad light, but generally if they have a couple architects on staff, they may have a few house plans on the shelf and they will use those over and over again sometimes. But sometimes when there's changes in the ordinance, they'll just make the change to the house plan and use the same one over and over again. But that's the sort of situation we saw in Metuchen. And Princeton, there was a lot of interest in the code, and many architects and builders came to the meeting, and I was like, oh boy, this is gonna be a long meeting. But because the models were displayed on the screen, explain what it was we were doing, almost all of them came away with like, oh, this is great. When will it be adopted? So it's been well supported. As far as generating interest to develop, from what I understand in Princeton, there's been a lot of interest developed, but I think it's a sort of unique market because it's anyone will build anything there. They'll build $2 million homes, and they will tear down a $1 million home to put up a $2 million duplex, no problem. In Metuchen, I didn't do quite a study, but what we realized and we explained to the public was that as a zoning official myself, I was approving applications through the exemption techniques. Oh, you don't need a variance, you get to be approved. But over the years, so many builders didn't realize that they were having that benefit. So, but once I went back and reviewed the permits, I I think I made a sort of a determination that hundreds of property owners were able to make additions, modest additions to the homes without the need for a variance. And it's not, you can never know how many wouldn't have done it if they needed a variance. And in many cases, like in Highland Park, you don't know how many people don't bother to do an addition because they think, as a perception, that the ordinance is too cumbersome to deal with. So we're hoping that this will sort of unleash that effort. But of course, we need to keep an eye on it. If there's too much development, we need to look at it and see what the impacts are. Because generally, when you try to make things easier, you really have to be careful with gentrification. So we just need to look at it balanced. That's why we need to be proactive and be mindful of these changes. But I would say undoubtedly, it's unleashed a lot of development and economic development. Really, it's obviously the single family industry throughout those communities. Once the ordinance sort of unleashed the chains around the bulk requirements.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Jeff?
Yeah, hi. Looking at, just want to be clear that the requirements, the form-based code is for new residential construction, single or two family, right? So in other words, and I don't, just want to be for clarity, it's not like if you don't have flowering trees in your front yard now, you'll have to put them in as a result of this ordinance. That's not what this ordinance is making you do, right?
Correct. So generally
Okay.
speaking, the ordinance is really applicable to new construction as well as large additions. We have a provision with a large addition. So we have a provision in 230-149.4B, the proposed written ordinances in the case of an application involving reconstruction of addition less than 500 square feet, so, modest addition, then certain standards can be waived at the determination of the zoning official or the board. What that is intended to do is to allow for those homes that are not conforming with the new form-based code to not trigger those requirements. We don't want to tell a homeowner that just has a really modest addition that, oh, now you need to plant trees everywhere.
Well, but we're not creating nonconformities with the shade and flowering tree revisions, are we?
Correct. We're not.
Okay. I just want to be
It
clear.
will only come into play if you're doing an addition greater than 500 square feet. So at that point, the justification is you're spending probably about $150,000. If you don't have the trees in your yard, you can add one or two more. Because existing trees obviously count towards requirements.
I didn't look. I don't recall the ordinance allows you to pay into the tree fund if you can't do it. I mean, there's no in lieu of or because the town ordinance does allow if you need to cut down a tree and you can't replace it, you can pay into
Just 1 second.
I don't know if you're open for that, but I think that might be an option.
Well, we defer, and at the end of the street tree section, we sort of defer to chapter 388, tree removal and protection. There's a provision regarding, what that provision does is it clarifies, sort of for codification purposes, that replacement trees or trees that are planted count as one replacement tree per that ordinance. And obviously if there's any deficit, whatever controls in that chapter are in effect. So if there is a deficiency, then you could pay into that.
Is that should be made clear if you can make it clear in the ordinance that there is a way to, if you cannot meet this provision, you could pay in.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that there's tree needs around the borough, and this could.
Okay. That's a valid point.
Kalidra?
Yeah, just kind of piggybacking on that, paying into a fund if you are taking down a tree and you're not able to replace the tree on your property. Could you contribute to the deficit of trees elsewhere in the borough?
Yes, that's the intent, and that's what the last section of both the shade tree and a street tree requirements and under N and O of the form-based code is intended to allow. That's why I was referring to chapter 388. But I hear you when you say maybe it could be more clear specifically. I don't think that would be substantive change, but we can talk to the borough attorney.
Maybe do we know the title of chapter 388? Because if it's something like pay into fund here, we could just add the chapter title if it's not, if it helps give direction on where people can go for reference.
Yes, chapter 388, tree removal and protection.
I didn't see this as a material change. I just more for clarity. I use the word clarity just to, for that.
Okay, thank you.
Dan?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you. I'm kind of a stickler for graphic design, and I really appreciate the use of high contrast colors in all these figures. You get a lot of stuff like this where it's like gradients of shades of blue, and it's impossible to tell what's going on. So thank you for using the high contrast colors. It made everything really easy to follow. That's all.
Thank you.
See any other hands? All right, well, I will just say, Chris, that I particularly appreciated that you incorporated our feedback regarding maximum height from grade level. You know, that was something the board who had approved previous applications were particularly concerned about, and I think the 4 feet is a great suggestion for that. I also appreciate how you approach the impervious coverage, especially with the small lots. For everyone who took the stormwater training information and how important it is to have pervious coverage to allow for efficient stormwater draining, but we do have to balance that with the needs of our smaller lot owners, the non-conforming lots, where you can go like this and hit the edges of the lot. And we want them to be able to continue to improve their properties without being encumbered by too much red tape. So I appreciated both those inputs. I thought they were good suggestions on how to approach those and good compromises. So I know you brought it out specifically in your presentation. I wanted you to know that I noticed and I appreciated it.
It's always going to be a work in progress.
All right. Any other comments from the board? Pedrick?
Yeah, I really appreciate the cleaning up of the housekeeping section. I think that will save people a lot of time and effort that are just trying to make modest improvements on their house. And I know for years, starting off on the zoning board, you'd get that deck that's just, you know, it's following the edge of the house, but it would have to go in for a variance or something. So I think that's really good and you know, long overdue. So I really appreciate your work it on both levels, but this is on the housekeeping. It'll save everybody, both the borough and the homeowners, time.
Khalidra?
Yeah, I also really appreciate the sliding scale and not just like hard numbers when it comes to the different size lots and the fact that Highland Park has so much architectural diversity and we have so much diversity in our lot sizes that it will, I think, open up the possibilities to more homeowners and make it easier and more approachable for people of various size lots.
Yeah, I remember when I looked at the neighborhood and looked at the ordinance together, and I'm looking around, like not all houses are centered on the lot, right? There are always, many cases they're shifted over and there's a driveway along the right side. And the current ordinance didn't allow you to do that. So just hopefully this addresses that.
Okay. Unless I see anyone else with more comments, I think at this point, Tanya, do we have any members of the public who may want to be heard at this time on these ordinances?
We have no public.
Okay, then I won't bother opening or closing public comments since we have no public, although I think this is a really wonderful upcoming addition to our code and furtherance of our master plan. I don't know if I just tipped my hand on how I intend to vote on this, but at this time, I will solicit a motion to find the ordinance changes not inconsistent with our master plan.
So moved.
Yep.
Moved by Matt, second by Alvin?
Yes.
Yes. All right, Tanya, can we take a roll call, please?
Mr. Brusher?
You're muted.
Mr. Brusher,
Scott, unmute.
Yes.
Mr. Chin,
Yes.
Ms. Hadhazy,
Yes.
Mr. Hale,
You know, a lot of people said how much they appreciate all your work, Chris, and I just wanted to add that as well. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that one of the first things that that Susie said to me at one point was, I got to think about form-based codes. So this has been a bit coming, but it's something that she thought about a while ago, and so I'm very happy that we got this done. So thank you very much, Chris, and I vote yes.
Mr. Malay,
Yes.
Mr. Pearlman,
Yes.
Mr. Stern Cardinal,
Yes.
Mr. Williams,
Yes.
Ms. Hand.
Yes. All right, very good. So that brings us to the end of our agenda items. Scott, anything interesting happening around town? Good gossip to share?
No gossip. The house is on Cleveland. He brought in his permits pretty much for all the houses, so we're doing the review on those. I think Chris got those as well. And we finally got the plans for the school at the end of Cleveland. We're still doing some, yeah, we're still doing some plan review on that, but they're going to start doing the footings and foundation over there. And they probably won't do any of the actual construction until about September.
Yeah, I was surprised it's taken them this long. They were really gung-ho on getting everything through and then disappeared for 6 months.
Well, part of the problem was actually getting the steel for the building. It was kind of pretty much backlogged, and then I just heard Amazon backed out of a couple warehouses, so that freed up a lot of steel, and now he can actually move along.
Good for him. I hope the plans go well. I'm glad to hear things are moving along on Cleveland, although I'm afraid to assume if that means the environmental issues were properly reviewed at this point or not. I see Alan kind of nodding.
I think they were. I think the people who buy the houses will be okay.
Good. That's good to hear. All right. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Oh, Khalidra? Yep.
Yeah, so we had two houses on South 7th Avenue that were presented to us that were going to be built on a lot that was split. It was a double lot and it was subdivided. And I've noticed that the houses don't look anything like what was presented to us originally. Instead of the houses that we were presented, I think they changed their mind and decided to go with modular homes that were brought in, and they look beautiful. But what is the deal with that? Is that okay to just change your plans like that, or like what is the process there?
Scott, if you want, I could probably take that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so that was an issue in the beginning because the builder who originally wanted to do the subdivision got a bunch of variances, but the variances were not related to the subdivision itself because the subdivision itself was conforming. They needed variances for the construction of the houses. So once the approvals were granted and the deeds filed for the subdivision, they were sold. And the new home buyers decided to go into a different direction. So we had to sort of restart the review. And the opinion I had given when I talked to the new home buyers was that if you need variances for a different house design, you need to come back to the zoning board. But I think by that time they already had settled on modular. That's sort of where they were heading, and sort of a personal goal they were trying to achieve. And it wasn't going to need variances. So once that was clear, then the issues related to the variances sort of went away. So then once that was made clear and confirmed by the zoning official that no new variances were needed, despite it being different from what the board approved, then it went to the zoning office and construction for approvals.
Because the houses, they're very modern. They don't look like anything in the neighborhood at all. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
But it is not what the neighbors saw when they saw the original plans presented. And so the neighbors thought they were getting two houses that kind of blended in, and instead there are two houses there that don't blend in at all.
Yeah.
They're very, it's very different
It is different.
architecture. Yeah, it's very different. It's creative, but I was taken aback by it a little bit because when I saw the houses being delivered, first I was shocked that there was modular houses because that wasn't what we had approved. And then secondly, just the aesthetics of both of the houses, which pretty much look identical, look like nothing in that neighborhood.
Yeah, to be clear though, if the board had approved a subdivision and needed variances for the subdivision itself, for example, undersized lots, I would have made a determination that any change to the house design would have had to come back to the board. But Roger Thomas and I, we spoke about the fact that since the subdivision itself was conforming, it would be no different than any applicant going to the board for a lot subdivision, no houses, and then each lot be sold and constructed with the modular homes. But I don't disagree. It was different. It was jarring because it wasn't something I had dealt with in quite a long time. And we spent a lot of time trying to determine whether or not I need to go back to the board, but we ended up making the determination it did not need to.
So basically the new buyers took their conforming subdivision, abandoned the variance approved building plans and went for a building plan that didn't need variances, but was, whoa, where did that come from? But they could do that under.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you said it better than me.
I think I think this is a sort of good point, Chris. I think you bring up, and it's something I've been thinking about. When planning board look at subdivisions or something like that, particularly in residential, and we see a rendering that has a elevation, right, that shows some architecture. I mean, it's entered as an exhibit, and the applicants talk off of it, but they're not making commitments unless they say otherwise. They're not making commitments to build based on that elevation or that illustration, right?
Correct.
And planning boards can't really say, well, okay, I see your exhibit A3 front elevations, and when we approve it, we're approving it with that architecture. I mean, that's not something that I'm not saying we should do it. I'm just saying that
Well, when we did the Walter Avenue apartments, we were very specific with them about how those fronts were going to look.
That's a redevelopment.
Yeah, that was the redevelopment plan. They had to build it that way. To Jeff's point about the house design being different, maybe I should probably be more clear. So when you have a situation like you saw on South 7th, when there were no variances for the subdivision, really they could present whatever they want for the houses, and it really doesn't matter, truthfully. But if there are variances needed for the subdivision, or they propose a house design that needs different variances, like the massing changes, but tries to take advantage of setback variances, that would still need to come back to the board because it's not quite what the board approved. So it's almost like a case by case basis, but in this case, it's on South 7, since there were no variances for the subdivision itself, and the new house design no longer needed any variances. It's completely conforming to zoning. I really had nothing to hang my hat on and say, you need to come back to the board.
But so we don't, I'm just curious. I mean, I thought part of like having the public come and give their feedback, especially people who live in the neighborhood and who want to see the look of the neighborhood improved by new construction and not necessarily have construction that detracts or makes unattractive their neighborhood. I mean, I do take a little bit of issue with that. It is kind of like a bait and switch. And especially in a neighborhood like South 7th Avenue that hasn't seen any new construction in 40 years. But there's been some new additions put on people's homes and some really, really beautiful renovations. And I think a lot of people were very excited, but I was physically there when those houses were brought in, and a group of neighbors were all kind of congregating on the street, and there was some confusion.
Yeah. I won't say there wasn't confusion on our end either, but it took some time to get it through the approvals. But I don't disagree with you personally, but professionally, from a plan's perspective, we couldn't make them come back to the board once they eliminated all the variances.
Totally understand, like, very technical, and I can appreciate that. It's, it was surprising.
Are there things in this new form-based code that maybe would have mitigated some of the new design impact?
No, don't forget, we're
Oh.
only dealing with bulk regulations, not aesthetics. So if someone were to propose a modular home that happens to fit with our new form-based code, there's no reason that we could or should deny it.
Chris, there's no notification requirement of when something is sold like that, like the subdivision, the plans for the subdivision were sold to a new developer, and I guess there's no way of notifying the neighbors that all bets are off. I don't know.
No, the only notifications is through the application process for the subdivision and variances.
Okay.
If they need to go back to the board, then it'd be renotice for
Right.
the amended application we filed with the typical notice.
Okay. Anyone have any other comments or questions about things happening about town or our prior approvals or denials? Although I don't think we've had that in a while.
Could ask one, but just real quick, it's not the old Sunoco property, but the two dwellings moving towards, from South Second. I know there was an approved site plan, a redevelopment agreement, and a site plan approval 2-3 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, and we have a couple of approved site plans with redevelopment agreements, and those projects never move forward. And I guess the question is, isn't the whole point of redevelopment to have projects move forward? So I'm going to ask you, what's the status of that particular site plan approval and redeveloper? I mean, redeveloper agreement and a site plan approval. I don't know the exact address, but I think hopefully you understand.
That was the one where they were gonna build like 4 with 5 in the back and the driveway behind the house. That
You're talking
one.
about tract B of the
Are you
downtown.
talking
tract
about
B.
Track B?
Yeah.
So, Chris, I don't know if you want to take this or I can take a shot and then.
I'm probably gonna look silly saying this, but I do not recall them getting site plan approval. I know we went through a redevelopment plan process to change what was permitted there. And Matt, I'll probably defer to any further negotiations, but there's still the issue of where to locate the parking.
Right, and they've decided that they're interested in doing offsite parking in some respects, and so they're willingly holding on to they're okay waiting until they can figure out some sort of offsite parking. So
They're waiting to see if we build a parking deck. Is that what's happening?
that's one of the things that they're thinking about, but they're also thinking about other potential places they could do additional parking.
Did they have site plan approval though? I wasn't sure.
I think my memory is they had site plan approval for 16 units, but the redevelopment allowed them to go up from that. So I don't think they have site plan approval for for more than the original 16 units.
Correct.
My memory, but I could be wrong on that.
I just my position is you have a site plan approval, and better to have 16 units than to wait around for a parking garage at some point in the future, or maybe 20. I mean, we need the housing now. So I don't know if the redevelopment agreement, there's a timeline for having to build a project. That seems, I'd like to, if you could find out about that, I'd be interested to know.
Okay, I can get you more information. Matt and I will.
Okay.
Okay. All right. I think we're okay for the evening. I still see that we have no members of the public who have decided to join us. So again, I'm not going to bother opening it up to public comments since there's no one here to give such comments. And unless last call for comments from the board. Then I will solicit a motion to adjourn for the evening.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion by
Second.
Alan, second by Pedrick. All in favor?
I.
Aye.
Aye. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you
Good
for
night, everybody.
joining
Good night,
us.
thank you.
Good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.
Good night.
Until next time.
Yep.